Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Silent Judgment. The gates of Aerolux Airlines gleamed with polished elegance, and Caroline Walker's heels clicked on the marble floor as she briskly walked toward the boarding door for Flight 327. It was a Monday morning, the sky outside an endless stretch of pale blue, promising clear skies and a smooth journey ahead. Caroline had been working with Aerolux for over a decade and prided herself on her unblemished track record. A flight attendant's job was simple in theory, but executed with such precision that only a seasoned professional could truly appreciate its depth. Aerolux was more than just an airline to Caroline, it was a microcosm of luxury, exclusivity, and grace. First class was her domain, the passengers her canvas, and every interaction a carefully curated performance. Her uniform was always immaculate, every wrinkle ironed out, every thread perfectly aligned. The polished gold trim of the name badge on her chest gleamed in the soft light of the terminal, reminding both herself and the passengers that she belonged here, at the top. She'd seen it all in her years of service: wealthy elites, celebrities in oversized sunglasses, and business tycoons who demanded attention before even stepping foot on the plane. Caroline had learned to assess a person at a glance, reading their gestures, their posture, the way they carried themselves. It was part of her job, part of the game that ensured everything ran smoothly. She could tell who would be demanding, who would be pleasant, and who would be a challenge. Today, however, things were different. As the passengers began to board, a family appeared that caught her attention in a way she hadn't expected. They weren't just well-dressed or polished in their mannerisms, there was something about them that was different. They were poised, confident in a way that spoke of power, but also deep, quiet wealth. The father, tall and dignified with a carefully groomed beard, held the hand of his young daughter, whose curious eyes darted around the terminal with wonder. The mother, with skin glowing in the soft light, moved with grace, her smile warm but deliberate. Caroline watched them as they walked toward the first-class section. Her job was to ensure that everything was in order. First-class passengers needed more than just a seat and a drink, they needed to feel like they were the center of the universe. But these passengers didn't seem to need that validation. Their presence alone commanded attention. "Excuse me, sir," Caroline said, stepping forward to intercept the father just as he was about to enter the first-class cabin. Her tone was polite, but firm, her smile practiced. "I believe your seat is in business class." The man's eyes lifted, but instead of the expected look of confusion or frustration, he simply met her gaze with a calm assurance. He smiled slightly and spoke, his voice smooth, almost as if he were humoring her. "No, thank you. We are in first class." Caroline felt a flicker of uncertainty. She glanced down at the boarding pass in his hand, noticing the first-class seating marker with a VIP code beside it. Still, something didn't sit right with her. There was something about the family's demeanor that seemed out of place. She had seen wealthy families in first class before, but none like this. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been some mistake," Caroline continued, her voice now slightly more insistent. "Could I please see your ticket?" The man's eyes darkened ever so slightly, but he remained calm. He handed over his boarding pass with a slight flick of his wrist, as though it were a mere formality. Caroline took it from him, her fingers brushing against the thick, textured paper. It felt different from the usual passes, heavier, more substantial. It was embossed with gold lettering. She glanced at the ticket, her brows furrowing as she read the name printed on the pass. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning: Gibson. Her heart skipped a beat. She had seen that name before. In the news. In the business sections. The Gibsons were one of the most prominent African American families in the country. They owned multiple companies across various sectors, including a growing empire in technology, media, and, most notably, aviation. Their wealth was legendary, their influence widespread. Caroline's hand trembled slightly as she handed the ticket back. "Apologies, sir. Please, proceed." The father nodded, his expression unreadable. His family filed into the first-class cabin with quiet confidence, as though they had been born for this world, and there was no place they didn't belong. Caroline watched them take their seats, her thoughts racing. She was no stranger to high-profile passengers. She had served the rich and powerful countless times, but this felt different. It was the look in the man's eyes that unsettled her. He didn't seem concerned with the status symbols Caroline had come to associate with wealth. His aura of authority was born from something far deeper, something beyond money or fame. It was the kind of power that didn't need to be flaunted. Caroline snapped herself out of her reverie and continued her duties. There was work to be done. Yet, as the plane took off and the cabin settled into a quiet hum, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had a duty to ensure the passengers' comfort, but what if she had misjudged them? As the flight progressed, the cabin crew went about their duties, serving drinks, ensuring comfort, and maintaining the polished facade that Aerolux was known for. But Caroline's thoughts kept returning to the Gibson family. She tried to focus on her work, but the sense of foreboding lingered in the back of her mind. Just as the flight reached cruising altitude, Caroline made her way to the front of the cabin, where the Gibson family sat. She found herself looking for any clue, any sign that would make sense of the unease she felt. But there was nothing. They were perfectly at ease, engaging in quiet conversation with one another, laughing softly. The father smiled as he looked at his daughter, brushing a lock of hair from her face. Caroline couldn't help but notice how the family seemed so normal, so unassuming. It was then that she realized something profound: they weren't trying to stand out. They weren't flaunting their wealth or their power. But they didn't have to. They belonged here, every bit as much as anyone else in first class. Maybe even more. Caroline moved on with the rest of her duties, her mind still spinning. She had seen many passengers over the years, but something told her that the Gibsons were more than just another wealthy family. The world would learn this soon enough, in ways Caroline could never have imagined. And so began the unraveling of a mystery that would leave her, and the entire aviation industry, reeling. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but Caroline found herself repeatedly glancing toward the Gibson family. Their calm, almost regal demeanor was in stark contrast to the usual first-class passengers she served. It was rare, but not impossible, for someone to exude that level of confidence without showing any signs of discomfort or the need to prove themselves. As she moved through the aisles, taking drink orders and checking on the passengers, she couldn't help but feel like she had missed something earlier. Had she been too quick to judge them based on their appearance? Had she let the trappings of luxury cloud her understanding? Caroline had seen countless families like the Gibsons over her career, families with their perfect manners, pristine clothes, and carefully crafted images. Yet there was a depth to the Gibsons that she hadn't encountered before. It was a quiet power, one that didn't rely on material wealth or status symbols, but rather on something intrinsic, something born of true influence. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew she was dealing with something far beyond what she had initially perceived. When the plane finally began its descent, Caroline had already returned to the front of the cabin, where she took her position for the landing. As the seatbelt sign flashed on and the last of the drinks were collected, she noticed the father of the Gibson family looking out the window. His gaze was far off, almost contemplative. His wife, on the other hand, was chatting softly with their daughter, brushing her hair out of her face as the girl giggled at some quiet joke only they seemed to understand. The image of the family, so composed and serene, stayed with Caroline even as the flight touched down and the plane taxied to the gate. She made her way to the front to ensure the family was taken care of upon arrival. But as she neared them, she caught sight of something that took her breath away. One of the other passengers, an older man dressed in a sharp suit, stood up and approached the Gibson family. At first, it seemed like a polite greeting between two strangers, but as Caroline watched, the interaction took on an air of familiarity that made her pause. The older man bowed his head slightly to the father, who returned the gesture with equal grace. Their conversation, though inaudible to the rest of the cabin, seemed to carry a weight to it, as if they were exchanging words of significance. The man spoke for a moment longer before turning and walking away, casting a glance toward Caroline as he passed, his gaze sharp and knowing. Caroline's heart raced as she instinctively moved closer, but she quickly stopped herself. Was she overstepping? She had no business eavesdropping, no matter how curious she was about the exchange. The Gibsons stood up and prepared to disembark, moving with the same quiet authority they had exhibited since boarding. Caroline stood frozen for a moment, watching as they made their way off the plane. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, but one thing was clear: there was something important about this family, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Later that evening, as Caroline sat in her apartment, the images of the Gibsons lingered in her mind. She tried to focus on other things: work, the errands she had to run, the new book she'd been reading, but her thoughts kept returning to them. She found herself Googling the name Gibson over and over, hoping for some clue that would explain the strange feeling that had settled over her. She found news articles about the family, of course. The Gibsons were well known in the media, particularly in business circles. They had made their fortune in technology, pioneering innovative new platforms that had revolutionized industries ranging from healthcare to media. They were known for their philanthropy, donating millions to causes like education, racial justice, and environmental conservation. Their company, Gibson Technologies, had become a household name, and many viewed the family as a symbol of modern success and influence. But the more Caroline read, the more questions arose. The articles were filled with praise for their business acumen and social contributions, but none of them went into much detail about the family's personal lives or the specifics of their rise to prominence. It was as though they had appeared from nowhere and quickly became pillars of society. The public image of the Gibsons was polished and flawless, but Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That's when she found the article buried at the bottom of the search results. It was a short piece, a brief mention in a trade magazine about the family's secretive ownership of Aerolux Airlines. Caroline's eyes widened as she read the lines over and over, the words starting to make sense in a way that sent a chill down her spine. The Gibsons owned Aerolux. It wasn't just a part of their portfolio. They owned the airline outright. Caroline's mind raced as the implications of the discovery began to sink in. She had been working for the Gibsons all along, serving passengers who, unbeknownst to her, were not simply wealthy customers, they were the owners of the very airline she worked for. The realization was staggering. She had served them with a degree of detachment, her professional composure never wavering, but now she wondered just how much of it had been an act. How had she never known? In a daze, Caroline returned to her computer and began to dig deeper, reading through old business filings, interviews, and corporate reports. The Gibsons had purchased Aerolux Airlines quietly a few years back, just as the company was struggling to stay afloat amid rising fuel costs and increased competition. The deal had been made through a series of private transactions, with little fanfare or public notice. The family had invested heavily in revitalizing the brand, turning the airline into the prestigious luxury carrier it was today. But no one knew the full extent of their involvement, least of all the staff. The more Caroline read, the more she realized just how much she had been in the dark. The Gibsons had structured their ownership in a way that kept their names out of the headlines, preferring to operate behind the scenes. They had rebuilt Aerolux into the dominant force in the luxury air travel market, shaping it into a brand synonymous with opulence and exclusivity. But the truth remained hidden in plain sight. Caroline's own ignorance about the ownership didn't seem to be a matter of oversight, it was by design. As the days passed, Caroline found herself unable to focus on anything else. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to stay detached and neutral in every situation. But now, as she thought back to the Gibsons' quiet confidence, their calm power, she realized how wrong she had been. What had she missed all this time? How many other passengers had walked onto Aerolux flights, carrying the weight of ownership in their pocket without anyone ever knowing? The thought of confronting the Gibsons seemed both daunting and absurd. What could she possibly say to them? How could she ever address the fact that she had, in her own small way, judged them based on their appearance, their race, and her preconceived notions about what wealth and power should look like? Days turned into weeks, and the reality of the situation began to sink in more deeply. Caroline continued to serve the passengers with her usual professionalism, but a new awareness had settled in. She began to notice the little details, the subtle ways the Gibsons interacted with the staff, their reserved yet knowing glances when they boarded the plane, the small but unmistakable sense of command they exuded. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They had already won the game. But Caroline was left to grapple with her own inner turmoil. The discovery had shaken her beliefs, challenging everything she thought she knew about privilege, power, and the dynamics of wealth. She had always thought of herself as someone who understood the world of luxury, who had been part of it for so long. But now, she realized how little she truly knew. The Flight 327 had been just the beginning. What Caroline didn't yet realize was that her journey into understanding the true nature of the Gibsons and their world had only just begun. And the lessons she would learn would challenge not only her career but her very identity, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, her biases, and her place in a world she had never fully understood. The days following her discovery of the Gibson family's ownership of Aerolux Airlines passed in a haze, each day blurring into the next as Caroline struggled to come to terms with the enormity of what she had uncovered. The cabin doors of Flight 327 might have closed on that eventful day, but the reality of her situation felt like an open wound, one that she couldn't stop picking at, no matter how much she tried to ignore it. Her entire worldview had shifted, the foundational beliefs that she had clung to for years crumbling under the weight of what she had learned. She couldn't stop wondering just how much of her life had been spent in ignorance, serving a family whose influence and reach were far greater than she had ever imagined. In the days that followed, Caroline became keenly aware of the subtle but palpable shift in the atmosphere at Aerolux. The other crew members went about their work as usual, serving drinks, checking in with passengers, and making sure the cabin was pristine. But Caroline couldn't shake the sense that the entire operation, from the polished floors to the immaculate service, was a carefully crafted illusion, one that was designed to give passengers the sense of being catered to by a world that existed for their benefit alone. She had been part of this world for years, never questioning the underlying forces that made it possible, never considering who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, everything felt different. On the surface, the airline continued to function as it always had, flights were punctual, the first-class cabins as luxurious as ever, the staff maintaining their impeccable standards. Yet Caroline began to feel a growing discomfort. She couldn't help but wonder how many other passengers, like the Gibsons, had silently slipped through the cracks of her assumptions. How many other families, business tycoons, and power brokers sat in first class every day, wielding influence and wealth that was beyond her understanding? She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, on her intuition and experience, but the discovery of the Gibsons had shattered that sense of certainty. As Caroline continued to process what had happened, she found herself growing more introspective. She began to ask herself questions she had never considered before. What did it mean to be truly powerful? What was the difference between wealth and influence, and how could someone wield both without anyone ever noticing? The more she thought about the Gibsons, the more she realized that their power was not just about money. It was something deeper, something rooted in their ability to shape the world around them without ever needing to be at the center of attention. They didn't flaunt their wealth or their status. They didn't need to. They simply existed in a way that made everyone around them aware of their presence, without ever having to make a single demand. It was this quiet authority that intrigued Caroline the most. She began to think about the subtle ways the Gibsons had carried themselves on the flight, how they had never once asked for anything, never once made a scene. Their grace and composure seemed to radiate from them effortlessly, as if they had mastered the art of being seen without ever having to draw attention to themselves. They were not the typical first-class passengers Caroline had encountered in her years of service. Most of them came with an air of entitlement, demanding attention and pampering at every turn. The Gibsons, on the other hand, seemed content to simply exist in their space, their presence enough to command respect without uttering a word. As the days turned into weeks, Caroline's fascination with the family grew. She found herself studying their interactions with the other passengers, observing how they navigated the flight with an ease and confidence that seemed almost supernatural. There was no arrogance in their demeanor, no pretension. Yet everyone around them seemed to instinctively understand that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. It was as if the air around them shimmered with an invisible force, an aura that drew people to them without ever needing to make a direct impact. They were masters of subtlety, wielding power in a way that Caroline had never encountered before. One evening, as Caroline was preparing for another flight, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues in the break room. They were talking about a recent meeting with the Gibson family, and Caroline's ears perked up at the mention of their name. She hadn't realized that the family had been involved in any meetings with the airline staff. It was a rare occurrence for passengers, especially high-profile ones, to have direct involvement with the day-to-day operations of the airline. But as the conversation continued, Caroline learned that the Gibsons were not just passive investors, they were deeply involved in the strategic decisions of the airline, actively shaping its future and guiding its direction. The family had invested heavily in the company, but it wasn't just about the money. They were determined to elevate Aerolux to new heights, to make it the premier luxury airline in the world. It was during this conversation that Caroline learned another startling detail. The Gibsons had been in the process of acquiring several smaller airlines, quietly expanding their empire across the globe. They were positioning themselves to dominate the skies, to create an aviation network that would rival any in the world. It was clear to Caroline now that they were not just owners of an airline, they were reshaping the entire industry. The more Caroline learned about the Gibsons, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the world they inhabited. They were not simply business people, they were visionaries, operating on a scale that was beyond her comprehension. They had the ability to reshape industries, to influence governments, and to guide the future of entire sectors without anyone ever realizing the extent of their control. It was a level of power that few could even imagine, let alone understand. Yet, despite all of this, the Gibsons remained entirely out of the public eye. Their names were rarely mentioned in the media, and they avoided the spotlight whenever possible. They had built their empire through quiet determination and strategic investments, choosing to remain behind the scenes while their influence spread like an invisible thread throughout the world. It was this anonymity that made them so formidable. By operating in the shadows, they had created a legacy that would endure long after the media circus around other high-profile business leaders had faded. Caroline found herself drawn to them, fascinated by their ability to control so much without ever seeming to exert themselves. She began to study their every move, trying to decipher the hidden meanings behind their actions. What was it that made them so powerful? How had they achieved such a level of influence without anyone ever noticing? As she delved deeper into the world of the Gibsons, Caroline's perspective began to change. She started to see the world through a different lens, one that was no longer clouded by the assumptions and biases she had once held. The more she learned about their background, the more she realized how much of her own life had been shaped by forces she had never fully understood. She had spent so many years serving the elite, catering to their every need, without ever considering who the true power players were. Now, she was beginning to understand that the game was much bigger than she had ever imagined. One night, as Caroline sat in her small apartment, flipping through yet another article about the Gibson family, she felt a strange sense of urgency. She needed to understand more. She needed to know how they operated, how they had built their empire. She couldn't stop herself from diving deeper into their world, searching for the answers to questions that had begun to consume her thoughts. It wasn't just about the Gibsons anymore. It was about everything, about the world of wealth and power, about the hidden forces that shaped the lives of ordinary people without their ever knowing. As Caroline's obsession with the Gibsons grew, she found herself questioning everything about her life. She had always been proud of her role at Aerolux, of the reputation she had built over the years as a top flight attendant. But now, she wondered if she had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. How much of her success had been the result of her own hard work, and how much had been shaped by the unseen hands of those who controlled the levers of power? The realization was unsettling, but it also sparked something inside of her. Caroline had always prided herself on being perceptive, on understanding the nuances of human behavior and the dynamics of the world around her. Now, it seemed, the world was offering her a new set of lessons that would force her to confront the deepest parts of herself. The more she learned about the Gibsons, the more she understood that they were not just a family, they were a symbol. A symbol of what could be achieved through vision, determination, and an unwavering commitment to shaping the future. They were the embodiment of a world where power was wielded not through force or spectacle, but through quiet, calculated moves that changed the course of history without anyone even noticing. And in that quiet power, Caroline began to see the potential for her own transformation, for the chance to reshape her understanding of the world, and her place in it. Weeks passed since Caroline's unsettling realization about the Gibson family's true identity and their influence over Aerolux Airlines. The days blurred into one another, each marked by an increasingly familiar undercurrent of tension in her mind. It was as if the reality of her job had fractured into pieces she could no longer ignore, each fragment revealing an uncomfortable truth. Once, her job as a flight attendant had been about providing excellent service, about ensuring comfort and refinement. It had been her identity, her calling, the life she had built for herself. Now, she wondered if she had ever really understood the forces that shaped the world she inhabited, and even more troubling, whether she was complicit in sustaining an illusion she had long believed to be real. The revelation about the Gibsons had changed her perception of everything around her. They were not just owners of Aerolux, they were shaping the entire fabric of the aviation industry. Yet, despite their vast influence, they operated with remarkable subtlety. Caroline had spent countless hours researching them since that fateful flight, but each new layer of information only deepened her awe and confusion. They had built their empire not through ostentatious displays of wealth, but by making quiet, deliberate choices, investing strategically, shaping public opinion, and influencing global economies without ever drawing attention to themselves. The world saw them as quiet philanthropists, a family committed to their community, and yet beneath that public image, they were architects of an empire. Caroline had become obsessed with understanding them, not just for the knowledge, but for the strange sense of discomfort their silent power stirred in her. The more she learned about their methods and the intricacies of their holdings, the more she felt like an outsider looking in. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore, she was someone working in the shadows of something vast and unknowable, a system where she had never truly been a part. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, on understanding the subtle dynamics of human interaction. But the Gibsons had proven to her that there was more at play than mere intuition. Their lives were a carefully orchestrated performance, one that few could even begin to comprehend. And it wasn't just about wealth, it was about control, about directing the flow of power in a way that no one even realized was happening. Every encounter with the Gibsons left her feeling more unsettled, more aware of her position in the world. As the family continued to travel in first class, Caroline began to pay closer attention to how they interacted with the crew, how they behaved in the small moments when no one else was watching. They were unfailingly polite, always smiling, always calm. But there was an unmistakable aura of authority surrounding them. The passengers who sat nearby would subconsciously straighten up, quieting their conversations, as though they too felt the weight of the family's presence. The crew, always professional, would shift their attention toward them with a sense of reverence, an unspoken acknowledgement that these were not just any first-class passengers. These were the masters of the game. Caroline had often heard the whispers from the other flight attendants about the Gibson family. They were revered but also feared, even though no one ever dared to speak openly about them. There were rumors, of course, rumors of their vast network, their secretive investments, their ability to make and break entire industries with the flick of a wrist. But the most intriguing part was the way they managed to maintain such a low profile. In a world where everyone was clamoring for attention, the Gibsons never asked for it. They simply existed, and in their silence, they commanded everything. It was during a routine flight to New York that Caroline found herself standing in the galley, preparing for the arrival of the meal service, when she overheard an interesting conversation between two senior members of the cabin crew. They were talking in hushed tones, their words full of reverence. "I've heard they're planning something big," one of the crew members, a seasoned veteran named Angela, said. "The Gibsons, I mean. The airline's just the start. I hear they've been working behind the scenes on something far more ambitious." Caroline's ears perked up. Something about the way Angela spoke about the Gibsons made Caroline pause. It wasn't just the usual praise you'd give to a powerful family, it was the kind of tone reserved for people who controlled the world without anyone realizing it. What do you mean, more ambitious? Caroline couldn't help but ask, leaning in slightly, her curiosity now piqued. Angela glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, her voice lowering even further. I can't say too much, but let's just say this, the Gibsons aren't just interested in being a part of the system. They're building their own. They've been quietly acquiring assets in every major industry you can think of, media, tech, even government contracts. They're positioning themselves to influence policy on a global scale. They're not here to be guests in this world, Caroline. They want to own it. Caroline stood frozen for a moment, processing what she had just heard. She had suspected the Gibsons were far more powerful than anyone realized, but this? This was beyond anything she had imagined. They weren't just players in the game, they were rewriting the rules themselves. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The family was building something that would shape the future in ways no one could predict. And they were doing it with a stealth that made them nearly invisible. For the first time, Caroline felt the true weight of their influence. It wasn't just about being wealthy or successful. It was about something much more profound, the ability to shape the future without ever stepping into the limelight. The Gibsons were not only rewriting the rules of business and politics, they were setting the course for an entirely new world, a world where their influence would be felt in every corner, from the corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of government. The flight landed in New York, and Caroline felt the usual sense of relief that came with a smooth flight. But this time, something was different. As she stood at the gate, watching the Gibson family disembark, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with unease. They moved through the terminal like royalty, quiet, unassuming, yet undeniably powerful. No one else seemed to notice them, but Caroline knew the truth. These were the architects of a new world, and she was just a small part of it. In the days that followed, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that she was a witness to something momentous. She had always been aware of the invisible forces that shaped the world, but now she saw them in a new light. The Gibsons had shown her that power wasn't about visibility or spectacle. It was about subtlety, control, and the quiet manipulation of the systems that governed society. They had built their empire through careful, deliberate actions, never rushing, never drawing attention to themselves, but always positioning themselves for the next move. Caroline began to see her own life through a different lens. She had always thought she was part of a world of luxury and exclusivity, but now she realized she was merely a cog in a much larger machine. The passengers she had served over the years, the ones who had sat in first class, were not just wealthy individuals. They were players in a game that she hadn't even known existed. Some, like the Gibsons, were shaping the future itself. Others were simply part of the system, enjoying the fruits of a world they didn't fully understand. And Caroline? She was just another face in the crowd, trying to navigate her way through a world that had far more layers than she had ever realized. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the Gibsons had forced her to confront a painful truth: she had never truly understood the world she inhabited. She had spent years serving the rich and powerful, catering to their every whim, without ever considering who was truly in control. Now, she knew. And the question was no longer whether she was complicit, it was what she was going to do with this newfound knowledge. The world was changing, and the Gibsons were at the center of that transformation. And Caroline? She was just beginning to understand her place in it all. As the weeks passed, the weight of Caroline's newfound knowledge continued to settle heavily on her shoulders, an invisible burden that seemed to grow with each passing day. The more she learned about the Gibsons, their vision, their influence, their control over entire industries, the more she realized just how small her role in the grand scheme of things had been. But it was also clear to her that this world she inhabited was not what it seemed. For years, she had thought she was a part of something grand, something glamorous, a world where luxury and privilege defined every interaction. But now, with the full knowledge of the power behind the curtains, she began to see the intricate web that held everything together, a web that she had unknowingly been caught in. Caroline had never considered herself naive. She prided herself on being perceptive, on being able to read the people around her, understanding their desires, their needs, their motivations. In her years as a flight attendant, she had mastered the art of anticipating the smallest gestures, an impatient sigh, a slight narrowing of the eyes, the slightest shift in body language that told her a passenger's mood or needs before they even spoke. But the Gibsons had revealed to her a deeper truth, one that no amount of intuition or experience could have prepared her for, that the true power in the world was not about mastering the immediate, the visible, but about controlling the unseen, the quiet movements that shaped the future in ways no one ever expected. Every day, Caroline found herself reevaluating her place in the world. She had been part of a system that was both glamorous and hollow, built on the image of luxury and sophistication, but driven by the quiet movements of those who held the real power. The world of first-class service, of polished floors and impeccable uniforms, now felt like a mask that hid the forces at play beneath. She had served powerful people, wealthy elites, and business tycoons, but the Gibsons had taught her that true power wasn't about wealth, at least not in the traditional sense. It wasn't about flaunting opulence or gaining public recognition. True power was about silence, strategy, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. As Caroline reflected on all this, she couldn't help but think of the Gibsons' philosophy. They had always been forward-thinking, strategic. They were builders, not of wealth for wealth's sake, but of influence for a much larger purpose. They weren't interested in simply being a part of the system, they wanted to reshape it, to build a new world, one where they could pull the strings from behind the scenes, where the systems of finance, media, and politics operated as extensions of their own will. She had once thought of them as just another wealthy family, but now she saw them as something far more significant. They were architects of a new era, quietly molding the world to fit their vision. But what did this mean for Caroline? She had spent years serving at the highest levels of luxury, yet now she realized that she had never truly understood who was in control. She had been an observer, a participant in a game where she had no real power. She had looked at passengers with a trained eye, studying their every move, anticipating their needs, but she had never looked beyond the surface. She had never questioned who was behind the curtains, making the decisions that shaped the course of events. It was only now that Caroline began to ask herself whether she had been complicit in the system all along. Had she been a willing participant in maintaining the illusion of exclusivity, of wealth and privilege, while the real players moved in the shadows, pulling the strings? Had she, by serving the powerful, been complicit in a world that worked to benefit only a select few? And, perhaps more disturbingly, what did it mean for someone like her, someone who had always believed in the idea of hard work and merit, to be confronted with the reality that, in the end, it wasn't about hard work at all? It was about power, influence, and the ability to remain hidden from the world's gaze. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the world she had inhabited for so long was nothing more than a facade. It wasn't about service or luxury, it was about maintaining a structure that served the interests of the few at the top. The Gibsons had created this structure, and now they were reshaping it to their own ends. They had built an empire, not through overt power or recognition, but through subtlety, influence, and the quiet expansion of their reach. And Caroline had been swept up in it, unwittingly playing her part in a system that had always been stacked against the people who had no access to that kind of power. It was a revelation that left her reeling. She had spent so many years looking at the world through the lens of her role as a flight attendant, thinking that her work mattered, that she was part of something important. But now, she saw that her role was, in many ways, insignificant. She was just one small cog in a machine that ran on a different set of rules, rules that she had never fully understood until now. The question that now haunted Caroline was what to do with this knowledge. She couldn't go back to being the same person, the same flight attendant who had served the wealthy with a smile, who had played her part in the show that made up the world of luxury travel. She couldn't go back to pretending that the systems of power she had worked within were just the way things were. She had seen the truth now, and there was no going back. But what was the next step? What did it mean to know the truth and yet remain within a world that was fundamentally designed to keep people like her in their place? Caroline had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to understand their desires, their motivations. But now, she realized, it wasn't just about understanding individuals, it was about understanding the larger forces at play. She had spent so many years serving those in power, but now she wondered if it was time to challenge those forces, to confront the system she had been a part of for so long. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had a choice. She could continue to serve the system, continue to play her part in a world that operated under a different set of rules, or she could step outside it. She could use the knowledge she had gained about the Gibsons and the systems of power to make a difference, to challenge the status quo, and to fight for something greater than the small world she had known. She had always been someone who believed in hard work, in earning her place in the world. But now, she wondered if there was a different way, a way to work not just for herself, but for the greater good, to challenge the very system that had kept so many people trapped in their place. As she stood at the threshold of this realization, Caroline knew that the choice before her was not an easy one. The world she had known was one of comfort and certainty, but now that comfort felt hollow. The Gibsons had shown her the depth of their power, and in doing so, they had shown her the depth of her own ignorance. She couldn't ignore that any longer. The time had come for Caroline to choose which path she would take, whether she would remain complicit in a system that worked to benefit the few, or whether she would rise above it, challenging the forces that had shaped her life and the lives of so many others. And so, as the days passed and the weight of the truth settled deeper within her, Caroline made a decision. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she could change her role in it. She could use the knowledge she had gained to make a difference, to challenge the systems that had kept people like the Gibsons in power, and to work toward a world where influence and wealth were not concentrated in the hands of a few, but were more evenly distributed. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, but she knew one thing for sure: she could no longer remain silent. The journey that had begun with a flight to nowhere had now become the first step in her own personal revolution. And with that, Caroline stepped out into the world, ready to face the challenges ahead, armed with the knowledge that the game was not what it seemed, and that the real power lay in her ability to change the rules.